Welcome to another episode of Story Behind the Painting. In today's episode, we will talk about one of the most famous and favorite artists from the 15th century, Albrecht Dürer. The painting chosen is Christ amongst the Doctors, made in 1506. And as always, we have a bit of tea in terms of context. So far in our episodes, we have seen ceremonial wars that seem like mercenaries doing a big stage wrestling performance with Paolo Uccello with the Battle of San Romano. Also the protections of wealth in marriages via Jan van Eyck. And also we've understood how Europe developed into the Renaissance that was a bit different from Northern Europe and Southern Europe Renaissance. All to say that today we will touch some crazy facts about history related with the Jews. Because in today's painting, the main context is Jesus with 12 years old in between doctors.
Welcome to Story Behind the Painting, where we dive into the most famous art routes and learn a lot from that.
Albrecht Dürer's Christ amongst the Doctors is a masterpiece of the German Renaissance, famous for its dramatic close-up composition and intense psychological energy. Durer, born in 1471 and died at 1528, made this painting in 1506, and it's now displayed in the National Museum Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid, Spain. I would say there's no better place for it to be nowadays. I mean, if you know, you know. It's made in oil on poplar panel, with a dimension of 65 by 80 centimeters. The painting depicts a pivotal moment from the Gospel of Luke where the young Jesus, after being missing for 3 days, is found in the temple in Jerusalem debating with learnt scholars. The true focal point is not a face, but the central tangle of hands. Jesus is seen using his fingers to systematically count out the points of his argument, while a weathered scholar next to him reaches out with gnarled, aggressive-looking fingers, creating a sharp contrast between youthful grace and aged intensity. Unlike the traditional paintings of this scene that show a large, airy temple, Dürer zooms in so close that the figures are stacked on top of each other. This creates a sense of intellectual pressure and claustrophobia. Jesus is portrayed with long golden curls and a serene, almost detached expression. He is surrounded by 6 scholars whose faces are highly individualized. Some appear skeptical, others confused, and one on the far right looks almost like a caricature with a hooked nose and a menacing gaze. On the bottom left, a scrap of paper sticks out from a book. It contains Dürer's monogram, the date, and the Latin phrase opus quinque dierum, which translates to the work of 5 days. This was Dürer's way of boasting about his incredible speed and skill whilst he was staying in Venice. Several large, heavy volumes are held by the scholars, symbolizing the weight of tradition and the written law they are trying to use to challenge the young Jesus' intuitive wisdom. This moment of early 16th century was a time of intense religious transition and social friction in Europe. To understand the era, we have to look at Dürer's 2 worlds, his home in Nuremberg, Germany, and Venice, Italy, where he painted this specific piece. The relationship between Christians and Jews during this period was defined by a mix of theological debate, economic dependency, and systemic exclusion. By the early 1500s, Europe was in the midst of a great expulsion era. In Nuremberg, Dürer's hometown, the Jewish community had been expelled just a few years earlier, in 1499. Their homes were seized, and their synagogue was turned into a church. Dürer grew up in an environment where Jewish people were officially unwelcome and often viewed through a lens of suspicion. In Venice, when Dürer painted this in Venice, the city was just 10 years away from establishing the world's first ghetto in 1516. While Venice was more tolerant because it needed Jewish merchants and doctors for its economy, it still forced them to live in a segregated area and wear identifying yellow badges or hats when in public. This climate of exclusion and expulsion didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of centuries of building tension that reached a boiling point during the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Catholic Church strictly forbade Christians from charging interest on loans, citing biblical passages that viewed the practice as a sin of greed or selling time. However, a growing European economy needed credit to function. Merchants needed to buy goods, and nobles needed to fund wars. Because Jewish people were not bound by Christian canon law, they were often the only group permitted to provide these essential financial services. Besides also certain actions that would be seen as threatening to several countries, by lending money at a high interest rate, the debt would become impossible to pay, and thus more power and pressure the lender could make to the borrower. To add to this, some situations of poisoning the water wells were reported, a bit like now pouring concrete in water wells. To contextualize with current times we live in, the issues of the time are part of the same today. At its heart, the crisis is mathematical. When interest compounds, it grows exponentially, faster than wages, faster than a person's labor, and faster than a nation's GDP. We have entered a state where millions realize they are working solely to pay the interest, with no hope of ever clearing the principal. This is the modern definition of being owned by a lender. As before, kings and queens would see their debt grow tremendously due to interest rates growing too much. That would only have three ways possible to solve: a jubilee, a collapse, or a war. Once the kings and queens saw that the interest rates were too extreme, they would need to take actions. Because the economical warfare would take place and the lenders would play their part on pressuring the kingdom, or nowadays the country. This is the big issue and also a motor of economical cycles, because the economical systems we've had so far are flawed. Where there's a debit, there's a credit, and if more money is put in the economical system without increase of value of the system, it only leads to lower the value of the money. For example, you have a cup of water mid-filled and you put salt. Salt is the value of the system. If you add water, you will keep with the same value, salt in the system, but more water, which means the value, salt is more divided, less concentrated. Now, if you add a gummy bear, the new innovation in the system, it will absorb the salt via osmosis. The water stays less salty, or you can put a bit of sea algae, another innovation in the system, and more salt value appears in the system without adding more salt directly. That's a bit what happens nowadays with the modern sovereign debt trap. There's this zombification of nations that they just are not able to pay their debt. Then they operate under the rules of heavy lobbying in which they have to take certain choices and actions to avoid increase of interests or avoid the payment of interest. Besides, if there's a net of influence that empowers the path of breaking moral values, we enter in the game of feed the hedonism of the few to enable the suffer of the many. Pretty much what we have nowadays, right? But returning to the painting, the primary goal of the painting is to portray the collision between divine wisdom, represented by a 12-year-old Jesus, and human tradition, represented by the elderly scholars. Durer uses a technique called physiognomy, the Renaissance belief that a person's outward appearance reveals their internal character. Jesus is portrayed with soft, symmetrical, and luminous features. This ideal beauty represents spiritual purity and divine truth. The scholars are depicted with grotesque or caricatured features, wrinkled skin, bulbous noses, and gap-toothed grins. Durer isn't just trying to make them look old. He is showing them as spiritually distorted because they are blinded by the rigid letters of the law and cannot recognize the truth standing right in front of them. If you look at the center of the painting, the true protagonists aren't the faces, but the hands. Jesus' hands show he is using a specific rhetorical gesture called computus digitalis, counting off arguments on his fingers. It shows he is calm, logical, and teaching with authority. The man with the white cap to Jesus' right leans in with gnarled, clutching fingers. He looks as though he is trying to physically grab the argument or overwhelm the child. The central knot of hands creates a visual whirlwind symbolizing the intense energy and friction of their debate. The scholars are literally and figuratively buried in their books. They are searching through the physical pages of the Old Testament to find a way to refute Jesus. One scholar has a bookmark where Durer actually placed his signature, symbolizing that they are stuck in the past, the law, while Jesus represents the future, the gospel. Almost like a criticism of nowadays where we study so much of the past, but we need new tools to face the challenges of the future. Applying old recipes to new problems ain't the way to solve them. We need to be creative, adaptive, try out, and if we fail, we try again until we get it right. Surprisingly, there is no record of a specific patron or lobby commissioning this particular work. Most art historians believe Durer painted it for himself or as a showpiece. Albrecht Dürer was the rock star of the Northern Renaissance. A German painter, printmaker, and theorist from Nuremberg, he was the first artist to truly bridge the gap between the gritty, detailed realism of the North and the mathematical, idealized beauty of the South. He was born in Nuremberg, which at the time was one of the most prosperous and culturally vibrant cities in the Holy Roman Empire. He was the son of a goldsmith, a background that gave him the incredible precision and line work that would later make his engravings famous. Durer's fame during his lifetime came more from his prints than his paintings, as they could be mass-produced and sold across Europe. The Apocalypse. From 1498, a series of 15 woodcuts illustrating the Book of Revelation. They were so detailed and terrifying that they set a new standard for what a woodcut could be. Night, Death, and the Devil from 1513, one of his master prints, showing a Christian knight riding through a valley of darkness, unbothered by the monsters around him. Melancholia Worst from 1514, a mysterious, highly symbolic engraving that many believe is a spiritual self-portrait of the artist's own intellectual struggles. Self-Portrait at 28 from 1500, a world-famous painting where he depicts himself in a pose usually reserved for Jesus, signaling the divine nature of the artist's creativity. Durer didn't just make art, he changed the business and science of art forever. Durer was the first artist to use a logo. His famous AD monogram was stamped on every print. He even took a Venetian artist to court for copyright infringement for copying his monogram, the first such legal case in history. He was obsessed with the correct way to draw a human being. He wrote and illustrated 4 books on human proportion, attempting to find a mathematical formula for beauty. He was trying to prove that art wasn't just a craft, but a branch of science and philosophy. Before Durer, woodcuts were simple, crude illustrations. He used the fine tools of his goldsmith training to create cross-hatching and shading, making woodcuts and engravings look as rich and detailed as oil paintings. This allowed art to be affordable for the middle class, not just the church or the kings. He helped move the artist's status from a humble craftsman, like a carpenter, to an intellectual elite. Because he could write about geometry, fortification, and theory, he forced the rulers of Europe to treat artists as peers rather than servants. So, as we close the heavy books on this episode, we realize that Durer's Christ among the doctors is much more than a 500-year-old Bible story. It is a mirror. Durer stood at the edge of a new world, just as we do today. He captured the moment where the old law, rigid, heavy, and buried in its own scrolls, clashed with a new way that was light, adaptive, and intuitive. When you look at those gnarled, clutching hands of the scholars, don't just see historical figures. See the grasping hands of our own modern financial systems, the interest rates that never sleep and lead us to the rat race from individual to nationwide. Thanks for joining us on Story Behind the Painting. Hope to see you on the next one, and if you want to empower yourself and start restoring your focus, pass more time exposed to art and culture through our mobile app. Our goal is to inspire you to go in person to museums and meet people, instead of living in this addicted tech world app notifications that makes us also zombies without thinking of the consequences.
Welcome to Story Behind the Painting, where we dive into the most famous art routes and learn a lot from that.